To my left is Akiko Hart, Interim Director of Liberty, the UK's largest civil liberties organisation. Next to her, Sir Martin Sorrell, founder and executive chairman of S4 Capital, who's also the founder of WPP, the world's largest advertising and PR group. To my right, Baroness Kate Fall, Conservative peer, who was Deputy Chief of Staff for David Cameron while he was Prime Minister. And next to her, old friend of the programme, Baroness Natalie, whatever I say is wrong, Natalie Bennett, Green Party peer and the party's former leader. You can also text your question to us on 84850 and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. More of you are doing that. And you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
And lots of stories in the news today. The government has approved a new North Sea oil field despite concerns from climate change campaigners. A major Tory donor says the Conservatives don't deserve to be re-elected. The UK's first drug consumption room is being set up in Glasgow. Lots more topics to talk about, but you set the agenda on this programme, so you decide what you want to ask. Alexa has provided the first question from Donald in Kendal, who says, should we have drug consumption units opened across the UK like the one being set up in Glasgow? Natalie, let's come to you first.
Well, a simple answer to you, Donald. The answer is absolutely yes. It's very clear that the war on drugs has failed as a policy. We need a harm reduction type policy, which is what exactly is being done in Scotland. And I think it's interesting that it is in the nations, when they can get away from the dead hand of Westminster, that we're seeing so many social innovations like this. Now, Scotland has a particular problem. More than 1,000 deaths and 400 to 500 people regularly.
That's the worst drug death rate in the whole of Europe, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. 400, 500 people regularly shooting up in the centre of Glasgow City. And so the government has acted sensibly and is trying to find a method that will enable people to both not die, most importantly, but also to ensure there's care, to ensure that there's on offer the ability to find a way forward, to find a way out of this. This is an entirely practical step. And I think it's interesting, worth noting, that in Scotland, both the Scottish and Tory parties within Scotland, I guess you could say with varying degrees of reluctance, but are nonetheless backing this. So we're seeing the innovation that the country desperately needs. Why are we not seeing it elsewhere?
And the UK government could have vetoed this, I think, but chose not to, which is interesting in itself.
Well, it's interesting. The detail of this, it gets very technical, but basically the Scots are not, have simply said they haven't changed the law, they're not going to enforce the law. There's a legal argument it could go, but I think it's very clear that the government, and indeed I think the Labour Party, probably doesn't want to pick a fight with their own sides in Scotland. Should
we not wait, though, to see what effect this has before? I mean, you said at the beginning of your answer, well, we should be rolling this out across the country. Shouldn't we wait to see if it works?
Well, I think there's plenty of evidence from all around the world that these do work. And, another example, when I was reading about this in Fife, which is a pretty small area, they have about one leg amputation a month. And forgive anyone who doesn't like horrible stories, switch off for a minute, because they have about one leg amputation a month because people are injecting into their groin, and that's very hard to do safely, and so people end up with their legs amputated. In a safer environment, you can stop things like that. The deaths, I'm afraid, are only the start of the damage, and these, we know from around the world, can reduce the damage.
Sir Martin Sorrell.
Well, not an expert in drug consumption or drug consumption units, but it's a symptom of bigger issues. I mean, it's just another thing that we have to deal with, and Scotland in particular probably is affected for probably the issues that I'm talking about are more acute. So maybe it's the right thing to do, maybe not. I don't know enough about drug consumption. I mean, clearly you do, but we'll have to see whether.
Well, that's a slightly barbed comment.
Well, but. No, it's not wasn't Bob.
Health policy is something every politician should be concerned about.
Absolutely. But having had a cancer issue myself in the last 6 months, I'm quite well aware of the problems around the health service and the inadequacy of the state healthcare system and the need for private healthcare system to support that.
We could start a whole other debate.
Well, you never know. We might get a question on that.
It's part of the whole thing. So it'll be more cost. we'll see whether it's effective. I think you have to do something about the source of drugs and where they get the drugs from. It's not just about a question about sitting back and saying, okay, we're going to do something about consumption and care and looking after people. So, but basically this issue it's a bigger issue. It's an economic issue, it's a political issue. It comes to, maybe we'll get into talking about that. I mean, it's a lack of leadership politically.
Akiko, I was in Bournemouth on Sunday night walking through the town centre about 11 o'clock at night, and we all think of Bournemouth as quite a genteel place. I mean, there were people there literally every 20 yards in shop doorways, clearly shooting up. You think, I mean, this is not the centre of a major city. I mean, we know that Glasgow's had these problems for a long time. This is a sort of classic, quintessentially English. Well, is Bournemouth a city? I don't know. But it's not something I was expecting to see. And you think, well, if this is needed in Glasgow, then maybe we should have discussions about whether this should be rolled out across the rest of the country, as Natalie has suggested.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think if you yourself have experienced difficulties coming off drugs or alcohol, or if anyone, in your kind of family or loved ones you'll just really have a strong appreciation of, the paucity of services across the country. It's very, very little available. So there's that geographical disparity as well, but also there's huge disparity in terms of support towards certain types of drugs, for example. So, for example, recently the Bristol Tranquilizer Service, which was the only national service focused on supporting people coming off minor tranks, so benzodiazepines and sleeping pills, was closed. So there's nothing available now at a national level. So
and that was actually only ever supposed to be a local service, wasn't it?
Exactly.
But the demand was such that it was there. Seems astonishing that it's closed.
Absolutely. I think 10 years ago there were 3.5 services, all of them, again, localised and trying to kind of fulfil a national need. So it's appalling. And I think, there are many reasons why, we've kind of struggled to kind of provide the kind of support that people need. One of them, I think, is because we've put ideology above evidence-based practice. I think this is a really good example of that. I think there are 16 countries which operate harm reduction services which are similar to this. There's a really strong evidence base that it works, and that's the route we need to go down, I think.
Kate, Conservatives generally have been in favour of fighting a war on drugs, but I'm not sure you can ever win a war on drugs. If we could have done, we probably would have done it by now. Do you think this is a good example of somewhere where somebody's trying something different? It may not work, but at least they're trying.
I agree. Look, an initiative is a good idea. With a problem this big, so many lives being blighted with it, you want to be creative. I wouldn't go straight in and roll it out. I would just see how well it works. But I think the reaction today was interesting. You really have everyone saying this is fine, or if they're not saying it's fine, they're not pushing against it. They're not trying a constitutional pushback in terms of the legality and the constitutional. They're just allowing it to go ahead. And when you hear the stories about drug use and the amputations, which Natalie mentioned, and it is horrifying. But the one thing I would add is you can't just try one thing to fight drugs. There is the cause, there is the supply, there is a policing angle, there is an illegal angle. So you've got to do this in a holistic way. You can't, this is not going to be the answer. But yes, let's have some creative thinking around it, and let's hope it works.
But do any
on its own, it's not going to.
Yes, as a set.
I don't think anybody pretends that
as
on
a
its own
set
it's
of
going to
policy.
change the
It's
whole.
going to save lives,
Yeah.
and that's
So-
a very good aim to start with.
I think there's about 1,200 lives have been lost from each year, also around that figure in Scotland, and the equivalent figure in England is in the low hundreds.
So it's much less.
We've talked about this on the programme quite a lot over the years, and I asked Nicola Sturgeon about it when I interviewed her, but she didn't seem to know why it should be so different in Scotland compared to all other European countries.
But that bothers me too, because the Tories have been in government a long time, and these policy failures are part of their failures, our failures, but also the SNP have been running Scotland for a long time. And I do worry about the focus there, why have they come so late to something which is such a tragic...
Well, she admitted she took her eye off the ball in an interview a couple of years ago.
Isn't it economic conditions are tougher?
Well, but there's also the situation that, of course, many things are not under the Scottish Government's control. Say, for example...
Well, health is.
Health is, but...
Although drug policy isn't. interestingly.
And also, poverty and inequality are big problems. And I mean, I know about this in great detail from trying to help people set up a universal basic income trial in Scotland. But of course, basically the Treasury, the Department of Work and Pensions said no because they control all of those policies. Now, Scotland has actually brought in some measures as much as they can through their tax system to try and tackle inequality. So they're doing what they can with the powers they've got. But a huge number of things are still controlled from Westminster.
Maybe we can't afford it.
Well, the Scots are doing it now, and we get hopefully, in a few years' time, we'll see the difference with the different tax policy.
Part of the bigger problem is about whether we can afford these things or not.
But they can't afford to leave it, can they? Because the impact on their society and their economy.
There are other priorities as well.
But they have complete control over the health budget in Scotland. Westminster has no impact, apart from providing a lot of the money, has no impact on that at all.
But drug use is not just a health problem. No. It's a problem driven by poverty.
Well, you can't have it both ways, because we keep being told, and I agree with this, that particularly in this area, it is a problem of public health. It shouldn't be treated as a criminal issue, and that's been a problem over the years in that it hasn't been treated as a health issue.
But underlying is an issue of poverty, of poor housing, of inadequate funding for all kinds of government services. It makes it harder for people to get out of being in drugs.
But all I'm saying is, responding to Martin's point, is that the Scottish Government can decide how much it spends on drug care, if I can put it that way, or cancer care, or whatever. And so you can't blame that on Westminster. They could have spent a lot more money if they hadn't, as Nicola Sturgeon put it, taken their eye off the ball.
Well, just like England, just like Wales, just like Northern Ireland, there are, of course, huge pressures and not enough funding. And over the long term, we've been putting far less money into health than, say, our European compatriots.
Inadequate management and inadequate government. Look what's happening to the SNP. So look what has happened to the SNP, and look what's happening now, and what may happen in the future. I think
sitting in London, right down the road from Westminster, and saying there's there's an isolated problem of inadequate government in Scotland.
You do want to know why it is that the figures are so much worse in Scotland than in England. That is a question that would be a reasonable question to ask while you're looking at how to solve it.
But I mean, that is an historic thing that goes back decades.
Yes.
That's all right.
No, of course it's not. Of course it's not. But there is.
You seem to be seeking to blame the Westminster government for this problem in Scotland. There is only one administration to blame for it, and that is the Scottish administration.
No,
they've been in power since 2007.
I'm saying that health problems are it's called the social determinants of health. I spent quite a bit of time speaking at a conference on this yesterday. Health is not just determined by the health service. Health is determined by everything from the quality of your housing to the level of your poverty.
Of course it is, but all I'm saying is
the air pollution to
you
your lack of green spaces, etc.
You can blame the Westminster government for a lot of things, but this you can't put the blame on Westminster for. If you're the SNP, I would suggest.
Well,
I know the Green Party are in power with the SNP, so you naturally.
Well, I don't speak for the SNP, but I'm very happy to defend the great things that Greens are doing as ministers in the Scottish Government.
If you say so. Right, we'll move on to something else in just a few moments' time. You're listening to a Watching Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:15.
This is LBC.
Dale.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
18 minutes past 8. With us on the panel for Cross Question tonight, advertising guru Sir Martin Sorrell. Do you like being referred to as a guru?
Fine.
Excellent. Akiko Hart, who's a future guru. Can I say that? Baroness Kate Fall, Conservative peer, and Baroness Natalie Bennett, a Green Party peer. Somebody just sent in a very rude question saying, why haven't you talked about the introduction of mandatory drug testing in the House of Lords? I mean
Quite right, too.
offensive, isn't it? Dear,
And the
dear.
Commons too.
And the Commons too, indeed. Right, David is in Enfield. David, what would you like to ask?
Good evening, panel. Following Sorrell Braverman's speech yesterday to the AEI, does the panel think that this government is racist?
What's your answer to your own question, David?
I don't know about the whole government, but I believe certain elements of the government are.
Which you presumably include Sorrell Braverman in?
Yes, that's after my lived experience in South Africa for 10 years at the end of apartheid, when the country was living under a system that classified people racially, and it's a long story, but that's my position.
Okay. Well, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has today rejected the Home Secretary's calls for international asylum rules to be tightened. Akiko.
I wondered if you would come to me first. David, I really liked your answer. Yesterday's speech, what to say about that? I was slightly on the fence about it in a way because, do we take this kind of thing seriously or not? It just wasn't very
have to.
credible.
She's Home Secretary.
I know, but it was just so not sensible or grown up or plausible, and that was the reaction,
What do you think the motivation was?
Well, it's clearly a leadership piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
But, there's an element of rogueness around it, which I think, and that I think kind of comes back to the, one of the main questions around the speech.
And it was cleared by number 10.
But was it?
No, it was.
Okay.
I know for a fact it was.
But why was it in DC?
Well, you'd have to ask her that, wouldn't you?
Mm.
So, I suppose going back to your question, it feels like, electioneering, but that's actually actively harmful to people and communities because of what you just said, Iain, because she is Home Secretary. You have to take it seriously, even though it is deeply unserious.
The issue she raised, though, even if she did it in a, shall we say, rather clumsy, cack-handed way to be kind, the issues she raised do have to be addressed, though. We're operating under asylum rules that were created in the 1950s. We're now in 2023. There are 145 countries belong to the the Refugees Convention, and it would be a nightmare to get them to all agree to reform it. But in the end, the only way that you're going to solve any crisis, and this is a crisis, is for countries to come together and agree a new way forward, isn't it?
So I completely agree. We need to be having a very different conversation about this, and it needs to be a grown-up conversation. Who is making the economic case for migration in government? Absolutely no one. No one is brave enough to make that, to make that
All the opposition come to that matter.
Exactly. And that is the problem. So, the solutions that are needed are going to require deep cooperation between countries. They're going to require a pan-European response. They're going to require deeply unsexy work, funding, the kind of processing systems, here. And that is very, very far away from the type of harmful rhetoric that we're seeing.
At a time when the world is much more fractured and much more fragmented, and the forces are deglobalising and de-risking.
But aren't politicians like her the reason that the world is fracturing? Because they're using divisive language.
Mobility has intensified and increased significantly since those rules were there, and it is a big problem. And it needs. I'm half Ukrainian, a quarter Romanian, and a quarter Polish.
That's a frightening combination.
It is a frightening, lethal combination. Lethal combination. My grandparents came from, we think, Kiev in 1899. Couldn't speak a word of English. Marriage certificate had crosses on it. So I'm very sympathetic to the immigrant case. However, having said that, the numbers involved are huge now. And the disruptions are huge. We're talking about Africa, the Middle East, wherever it happens to be. And it's the rules were created at a time when the problem was a very different problem in terms of scale. So much as we dislike what she said yesterday and the reasons maybe why she said it, there is a point there which you pointed out, which is you have a massive problem that you have to deal with. And how do we get together to deal with it at a time when we have major geopolitical problems which are pulling people apart?
And they're only going to get worse as well.
Exactly.
Which is a cue for Natalie to say that climate change will be worse. But, I mean, if you accept, Natalie, that we can't have open borders in this country. We're not. I mean, you could argue that Australia could, that maybe America could. They have the landmass. I don't think anybody's really saying that there should be open borders, but she's, in her speech yesterday, which I did listen to the whole thing, she seemed to be arguing, or the effect of her argument would be that Britain wouldn't be taking any refugees at all.
Well, I think coming back to David's question to start off with, and I think David in his own answer very clearly made it clear, he said, well, some parts of the government. And as Akiko said, this was a deeply unserious speech. If you take it from a Home Secretary, it was clearly a bid to be on the Trumpian right. If you take it as someone who's going for, after the Tories lose the next election, going for Tory members' backing. And that's, we don't have a government. We have a far-right, chaotic mess of people who were just fighting among themselves, and that is a huge problem. But to come to your specific point, I mean, yes, there are going to be a huge number of climate refugees. The first thing to say is that the vast majority of the world's refugees are in neighbouring countries, often poor neighbouring countries who are welcoming them despite the most overwhelming barriers and problems of caring for them. And I think, Britain has shown what it can do. Martin referred to the Ukrainians, 180,000 Ukrainians. Greatly welcome that. I'm co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong. Britain has done an excellent job of welcoming people from Hong Kong. Why have we not done the same job for Afghans, including significant numbers of Afghans who worked for us and are now have their lives in most acute danger because of what they did? Well, I think we look at across the whole of the EU, they receive 22 asylum applications per 10,000 people. We get little more than half of that, 13 asylum applications. And I just want to pick up one point. Because there is a party that's prepared to look at those issues and talk about this in a positive way.
Who would that be, Natalie?
It would be the Green Party, you'd be surprised to know. And I can appoint you to I had a 10-minute speech, unusually opportunity in the House of Lords. And I pointed to the fact that if you look at how this debate is going to change, I'm confident it will change in the coming years. We have got global birth rates falling off a cliff. We have fast ageing populations around the world. I believe we are going to shift quite soon to a world in which people are going to recognise human resources, people, their energy, their time, their talents, their abilities, is a resource that we have to treasure and value and look after. And we want a world where no one is forced to move, but people who want to move by choice should have options, whether they come from the UK and restore freedom of movement with the rest of Europe, which our young people so suffer from not having now, or to allow a balanced number of people in from all around the world.
With all due respect, that's utopian at a time when the fractures in the world, US, China, Russia, Ukraine, Iran, take the top three, in my view, when it's splitting apart. And these are issues that are probably unsolvable.
What do you think about the birth rate?
I agree. Elon Musk, go on YouTube, watch the interviews with. Sorry for mentioning it. Go and watch what he says about. Absolutely, he's one of the people that calls it. You're absolutely right.
Isn't this a strange thing for you to say, Natalie? Because over the years, the Green Party have warned about overpopulation, and if we have a lower birth rate, presumably the population comes down. You should be delighted.
The Green Party has always said that the human footprint is a product of the number of people multiplied by their consumption levels. The UK, we use our share of 3 planets every year. And we've only got 1 planet, so we have to cut our consumption. That is the issue, and it has always been the issue, and that's always what the Green Party said.
Kate?
So, first, I think the language is pretty ugly, and as a Conservative, I find it makes me feel uncomfortable. So I'd start with that. Secondly, I think that it's a distraction. from the fact that she hasn't delivered on small boats. And actually, migration has gone up and up and up. And in fact, that's the one place where I'd slightly disagree with the conversation, because we have got economic migration. It's actually going up. So the government don't talk about that, but they are doing it. So I think that's partly why she's going to America and making this speech. She's also, clearly it's a beauty pageant coming into next week, coming into the party conference. I remember in 2015 when David Cameron had said he wasn't going to run again, coming back after a victory. It should have all been about him. And what did we have? We had a beauty pageant for the next leadership. So that's what we're seeing as well. And then finally, I would just say this is an incredibly important issue. There are lots of variables here. Climate's one of them. War, Nagorno-Karabakh, we just have another one. We're going to get lots more refugees, some of them economic, some of them who really are, avoiding war, famine. And we have to be honest with people about the pathways, and we probably do need to sit down with all our allies internationally to talk about it. So please, can we do that rather than make speeches that get headlines and make it more difficult to have those conversations?
I mean, as someone who used to work in Number 10, you would have expected the speech to be cleared, probably through you, maybe.
Yes.
Why do you think they did clear it?
Well, there's clearing of speeches, as you may know. And I mean, sometimes you see a speech and then the really exciting line is not there. Oh, it came in at last minute. Or if you actually look at the
there's always a way around
yes. So I don't know whether they cleared the full speech or not, but I read every party conference speech that every cabinet minister gave, and you didn't even always see the punchy lines right there.
And what happens when you read a speech that someone wants to give at a party conference and you think, well, actually, A, this isn't government policy, B, this is somebody putting forward their leadership ambitions. How do you handle that?
Well, you have a tough conversation with them, and the Number 10 heavies get heavy with them. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Well, in my day, it would have been, myself and Llewellyn and Craig Oliver and the comms people, and sometimes even, the boss.
I can't imagine any of you being heavy.
We were effective. But yeah, sometimes that didn't work. And especially if they felt there was an opportunity. And that comes back to the point I said about 2015. David didn't really give people an opportunity, or there wasn't a lot of leadership chatter during his time, apart from Boris, of course. And Boris, you could never control his speech. Even he didn't know what he was going to say.
It's slightly strange, isn't it, that if it did go through Number 10, that it was allowed. If you think about it, if it was primarily the beauty pageant, as you laid it out, and I agree with you. I mean, I think everybody in the cabinet and beyond are looking at their futures post the election, assuming that the Conservatives lose.
But surely the interesting thing here is that Rishi Sunak himself is apparently quite hardline on immigration. So you've got the two of the top people in government, both of whose parents immigrated to this country, both of whom are non-white, and
and they're missing their targets.
Yeah.
That's the point. I mean, that sort of distraction point, I think, is important, because they know, one of the top 5 of Rishi's targets, small boats, it's not going well.
But I think, Iain, I've got to pick you up on being tough on immigration. As Kate pointed out, there has been opened up lots of routes into the country, immigration. What they're being tough is very deliberately, in a very stagey, very theatrical manner, is tough on some of the most vulnerable people in the planet, i.e. refugees.
Well, they would no doubt counter that a good proportion of the people that are coming across the channel do not qualify as refugees, but that's kind of a whole different argument, which we haven't got time to go into.
I mean, last year it was there was only 24% of applications were refused, and those would have mostly been people coming across the channel. And then when they appeal, a third of the appeals are then successful. So the vast majority of people are refugees.
Right, we will move on in just a moment. It's 8:32, news headlines on LBC with Charlotte Morgan.
The Metropolitan Police Commissioner is describing the stabbing of a 15-year-old girl in South London this morning as impossible to comprehend. So Mark Rowley's been visiting Croydon in the area where it happened. The UK's first facility where people can take illegal drugs safely has been approved. It's hoped the consumption room, which will be based in Glasgow, will cut the number of deaths from overdose. And a US soldier is facing military disciplinary hearing in America after being expelled from North Korea. 23-year-old Private Travis King crossed the heavily armed border from the south in July. LBC weather. Outbreaks of rain in northern areas easing overnight. Staying breezy, though, with a low of 10.
This is LBC. Where? Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:36. Sir Martin Sorrell, Natalie Bennett, Akiko Hart and Kate Fall with me answering your questions. Let's go to Rory in Reading. Hello, Rory.
Hello, panel. So my question is, what did the panel make of Lawrence Fox's comments on TV last night, and is it symptomatic of how we treat women in politics?
Now, Lawrence Fox and his colleague Dan Wootton were both suspended from their TV shows today over comments which Fox made about a female journalist, used to be a colleague of mine on LBC actually, on Dan Wootton's show. Fox then posted screenshots online of text between the pair after the broadcast, which suggested Wootton had found the comments amusing. Let's start with Natalie.
Well, what we're talking about here are two vile men who are the sort of people you see thrown out of the pub quite early on a Saturday night. I don't really feel like giving them any great deal more publicity, but I think it is worth looking at GB News and its place in the whole national conversation. So to answer Rory's question directly, there are problems with how women are treated in politics, but this is on a whole other scale, and we really have to ask, what is GB News and what is it doing to our country?
I mean, it's slightly ironic that this whole farrago resulted from a discussion on a BBC programme, Politics Live, where Jeff Norcott, the comedian who's often on this programme, he was promoting his book, which is called The Basic Bloke. And he was talking about the fact that he was asked to, should there be a minister for men? And he was saying, well, on the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, no. And the two female panellists, Ava Santina was one, and Frances O'Grady, the ex-TUC General Secretary, was the other. And they slightly rolled their eyes at this. And he was talking about the fact that the main killer of young men is suicide. I mean, a very serious subject and worthy of discussion. But they then diverted it onto, well, yes, but we should be talking about harm to women and girls, which, I mean, we do talk about a lot in the media at the moment, possibly not enough. So all emanated from that, and Laurence Fox was basically having a go at Ava for her contribution to that discussion. But it just degenerated into something very ugly, didn't it?
I mean, I didn't see it, but it sounded really vile and horrifying and actually just quite depressing if public discussions go to that level. And I mean, I agree with Natalie, it's separate but related, that I do, whenever I see an MP, woman MP, and I admire all people for putting themselves out there, and whether I agree with them or not, I do think it's tough there. I think they get attacked on social media more than others. I think it's a tough environment, and I hope we don't make it so difficult that we see a falling out of women in public life, because our Parliament would be less for it.
And female journalists, I mean, do have a hard time.
Sure.
I remember in the 1990s when a group of female political journalists, and there weren't many to the pound of those at the time, they were referred to by their male counterparts as the leisure lobby.
I mean, it's horrifying. And when I first got involved with politics with David Cameron, I remember the Blair election and the 101 female MPs at the so-called Blair Babes, and we had 13, I think, at that Parliament. And that was definitely something that I personally worked hard on the whole way through those opposition years with David Cameron and in government, just to encourage and really cajole really positively to get more women in the party. But it goes forward and then it sometimes...
Well, if you look at the number of female Tory candidates being selected at the moment, there's 68 being selected, and I think 17 of them are women. Thanks to Michael Crick for that information.
Thank you, Michael.
Akiko.
I'm not sure I've got a huge amount more to add to it, really. I mean, it's perhaps a decision where I happen to agree with GB News, which is a little bit of a first.
Well, there you go.
Appalling, and really we sort of grace it with comment. We really shouldn't go into it too more deeply. I think the biggest issue is for GB News. Where does it put them? And it's a big strategic issue for them as to whether they just indulge in controversy for controversy's sake, as we see, in America, say, between Fox News and others, and other stations on the other side of the political spectrum. And it's appalling. But on this question about how do we get more people in political... I mentioned before, did you see the Laura Coons? I shouldn't mention competitive media outlets.
I'm a great fan of Laura Coons.
But 3 times 1 hour special. And in that, Amber Rudd said she doesn't know of an MP that hasn't received a death threat. And you compound the bigotry with that. I mean, that's why you have so few candidates. I mean, who would... This is my biggest bugbear, the lack of political leadership that we have. I long for the days of Blair and Thatcher and JFK going across the Atlantic. I mean, we just don't have it. So why is it that people don't go into political service or the quality? I mean, look at the candidate.
Did you ever think of doing it?
Never. No.
Why not?
Partly because I find it difficult enough in business to align people strategically. I think in politics it's impossible. You don't have the levers that you have in private industry or indeed public industry.
Yeah, because if you make a decision as a chief executive, you expect it to to be carried out there and then, don't you?
But it doesn't get carried out.
Well, it probably gets carried out longer. If Kate made, or David Cameron said to Kate, right, I want the Department of Transport to do this, you would ring out someone in the Department of Transport and pull a lever, and then 6 months later something might have happened, but if you didn't progress chase it, it probably wouldn't have.
A lot of progress chasing is needed in government, a lot.
Organisational alignment is the biggest issue, right? And I think think organisational alignment inside a political organisation is even more difficult.
But it is interesting, isn't it? We're going way off the question here. Sorry, Rory.
It's underlying it.
If you look back, the history of business people getting involved in politics is not a happy one, is it? It generally doesn't work.
Somebody said to me last night, this morning actually at the breakfast, said, what about the time when people used to get into business? And I instantly said Philip Green. And he laughed. But you go back in time, some did do that, and there were some really good ones that did it. But I think it's become more and more difficult. And, I think...
Lord Young, I would say, was the one that did
excellent.
work.
He was
but
excellent.
Archie Norman, did he ever really achieve what he set out to in politics?
I don't think he did. Somewhere. He got somewhere. But I think Weinstock, way back, did stuff. So I think there are precedents for it. But I think now it's extremely difficult to do. I think it's much more difficult to do now than before.
I think this is what I love about this programme. In a question about Lawrence Fox, we end up talking about Arnold Weinstock. We'll come on to another question in just a moment. It's 8:45.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:47, Sir Martin Sorrell, Natalie Bennett, Akiko Hart and Kate Fall with us answering your questions. Here's a text question from Matt in Poole. 80% of the oil from the new Rosebank North Sea oil field will be put on the market to be exported. Can ministers really say this is about a secure transition from Russian energy? And where will the proceeds go? To the government to invest in green projects, or is it the green just going into the pockets of private companies. Now, the regulator, the North Sea Transition Authority, has approved the opening of this oil field today, but it still could face legal challenges. Natalie, again, I'm going to come to you.
Well, this is a morally obscene decision from the government, and I think
it's not the government, it's this Quango.
The government could have made the choice and made the decision and made the policy. It's very clear the International Energy Agency, not known as a radical green body, said in 2021 there can be no new oil and gas development. What we've got now is...
That was before the Ukraine war, wasn't it?
The government's claim to justify this in talking about Russian gas. We were getting, before the Ukraine war, less than 1% of the gas came from Russia. Most of our imported gas comes from Norway, which actually has the carbon intensity of that gas is 2.5 times. Where ours is, that we take out ourselves, is 2.5 times as bad as the Norwegian. Theirs is far cleaner. And of course, what we should be doing is investing in renewable energy and what no one ever talks about, energy conservation. The cleanest, greenest energy you can possibly have is the energy you don't need to use. And what we're talking about now is you're starting up something that, in terms of economic investment, would expect to last for 20 or 30 years, well past the point when we should not be using any significant amounts of oil and gas. This is either going to pump us right over 1.5 degrees into extraordinarily dangerous territory, and just look at the state of the world now, where we are now.
This one licence would do that.
What we're talking about is a huge amount of energy, and once you start pumping it out, then you're not going to stop. If you do stop, then you've got the carbon bubble problem of a huge financial loss.
But do you think it's realistic for us to stop using any oil and gas by 2050?
Oh, absolutely. We have to. That's what the world has to do. We are going to see a huge amount of social innovation as well as technical innovation. Where we are now as a world is profoundly unstable. Just look at the floods, the fires, the droughts, the issues of food security. We cannot keep going on this path. We will not keep going on this path. We're going to see massive change. And what I would say is that's actually good news, because kind of circles back to where we started. We have a Britain with very poor levels of public health, very poor levels of mental health. We have poverty, inequality, insecurity. We need to build something much better and much different. Okay. And that must not be built on fossil fuel.
Martin?
We don't have the resources, and this is another indicator that we don't have the resources to deal with climate change in the short term. What we've noticed with clients is climate change has slipped wrongly, I would say, slipped down the agenda because the short-term economic pressures, the cupboard's bare. When you think about what the decisions around HS2 and other areas, those decisions are being made because the cupboard is bare and the economy is not strong. Going back to the drug problem, that's the central issue. Is we're not growing, the economy is weak, we have heavy government borrowing. One of the problems about investing in equities is that the government has to fund a borrowing program, which institutions are going to have to pile money in and come out of equities into bonds at a time when interest rates are high. So it's the economic realities in the short term, and where I think the Prime Minister is right, who understands these things because of his background and his training. What he's signalling is the cupboard is bare, and if Labour gets in the next after the next election, they will be faced with the same problems. They will be just as bereft of direction as we're seeing at the moment.
Akiko.
Yes, I think where you're right, Martin, is that there is, going back to your earlier point, there's a real lack of leadership here at the moment. This needs to be seen in the context of the recent decision about rolling back on the net zero commitments. There seems to be a huge amount of flip-flopping around some of these targets. That's terrible for business, Martin, but it's also terrible for us, for our children, for our planet. There's not a sense that we can trust this government, and perhaps even Labour as well, with making the tough leadership decisions that need to be made around this. It feels really short-termist and cynical, and I think all your points, Matt, about where is this money actually going to be going, etc., are really well made.
Kate.
So if you could deploy a security argument on this one, I think it would be strong, but it does not look like that really stands. And it seems to me that it all went back to Uxbridge, that the lesson the government took from the fact they just secured those seats on an anti-ULEZ platform was, instead of thinking, right, let's be very careful about putting extra bills on people who are already hurting, which to me is the right question to ask, but saying, how do we be green whilst protecting people? And showing leadership in the most important issue of the day that matters more than practically everything, especially to young voters. We've actually gone sort of happily down this wedge approach, and everyone's rather looks at the streets of gold that lead to hell type thing. I feel like it's not really, doesn't make sense in terms of the issue, and it doesn't make sense in terms of the politics, because it seems to me to be quite a core political vote.
Apparently in the Netflix documentary has just come out on Mrs. Thatcher, there's a sequence in there where a minister recounts that he went to Mrs. Thatcher on a policy, I can't remember what the policy was, and said, do you realise, Prime Minister, that if you do this, you'll lose the next election? And she said, it's not about winning or losing the next election, it's doing what is right.
Exactly, but that is exactly the point. But I would say that I think Labour have also not stood up to this test very well. Mm-hmm. They, given where they are in the polls, if they had slammed this announcement and said that they wouldn't support it, it just wouldn't be going ahead because it's too much for long-term investment.
It's not really very impactful, though, is it? I mean, I don't remember there being a great outcry a few months ago when the EU announced they were going to do the same thing and delay the introduction of mandatory electric cars.
It's taken together, though, isn't it?
2035.
It's the announcements about net zero taken with this. The indicators are. We are basically putting forward what looks like a not taking climate terribly seriously at a time when people are very anxious about it. I feel like that's not showing leadership in an issue that we really there should be a Tory Green.
It's short-term financial
agenda.
Considerations. That's what's driving it.
Well, no, it's political considerations, and I think entirely the wrong lesson was taken from the Uxbridge by-election, because Labour, of course, just as they're doing on the Rosebank oil and saying they're not going to reverse the decision, they backpedalled and essentially didn't back Sadiq Khan, so there wasn't an option being put there from the larger parties. What you had was just wobbles all round, and I'm afraid that describes far too much of our mainstream politics.
But that's a massive opportunity for your party, isn't it, really? And are you in a position to take advantage of it?
Very much so. I mean, if you look at the graph of the number of Green councillors we've elected over the last 3 or 4 elections, and we are absolutely focused on electing more Green MPs at the next election, and we're going to see a kind of massive growth, and that's what we're aiming for.
Well, of course you're aiming for that. But you always flatter to deceive at general elections. That's the point I'm making. Well,
what we have now is we have the foundation of all of those councillors. I mean, we went over 4 years from about 140 councillors to 740 councillors. You think about what the shape of that graph looks like, and they're the foundations on which you then get MPs. But
even the Liberal Democrats have got sort of, 3,000 or 4,000, and the two biggest parties have got many more than that. So as a percentage, yes, the graph has gone up, but it's still only a very small percentage of the entirety of councillors. But
what's different for us is we actually offer a complete political philosophy, a way of change, a different way of doing things, which the Lib Dems don't.
Well, of course, they would naturally say that they do, but the problem
I don't think they.
The problem is that
doing things differently.
You can offer a massively different policy platform at the general election. You can promise anything you like, but you know that you're not going to be part of a government.
I think there's a lot of people going around assuming there's going to be a very large Labour majority at the next election. I don't think that's a guaranteed outcome. And if we're talking about people in governments, well, there are more
coalitions.
There are more Green ministers on these islands now than there are Lib Dem ministers.
Well, that is certainly true. But I shouldn't have said that you couldn't get into government, because Roger has a very different idea. He says, Iain, Baroness Bennett for PM, is it feasible? What do you think?
Well, I am preparing for the first Green government. That's something that I have been always thinking about.
Who would be Prime Minister in a Green government?
We have co-leaders. We may well have
You can't have two Prime Ministers.
Who says?
I think our unwritten constitution would say that.
Which everyone says it's an unwritten constitution. It's very flexible.
It would have to be very flexible for that, I think. Right, we spent quite a long time on that, so let's go to our fun question for the end of the programme, which is from Barry in Derby. Mick Jagger says the Rolling Stones might give away their entire back catalogue to charity after other artists sold theirs for hundreds of millions. If you can own one song and only you can listen to it, what would it be? I think that's a cracking question. Kate?
I'm going to go, this is difficult, with Country Roads, John Denver. I'm actually half American. I used to be able to play that song on my guitar, singing along with my mother. So
See,
there we
I'm
are.
thinking that was Glenn Campbell, not John Denver. Am I wrong?
Well, John Denver did the best version.
All right, okay.
So we'll stick with John Denver.
Okay, Take Me Home, Country Roads. Yeah, good one. Olivia Newton-John sang it as well. I have it in my 45 singles collection.
I do.
Natalie?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to do the politician thing and say to Barry that I believe, and Green Party Arts policy is that music should be something that everyone's able to participate in.
Get with it.
So I'm going to follow the Rolling Stones and not try and grab resources for myself, but share them with everybody.
All right, what's your favourite song of all time then? Let's put it another way.
I Was Only 19, an Australian song against the Vietnam War. It's one of the most powerful anti-war songs I've ever heard.
It's called I Was Only 19.
Yeah,
right.
And it's about a young lad who goes off and comes back severely injured.
Let's put dampener on the proceedings. Martin?
Chet Baker and Jerry Mulligan. My Funny Valentine. I'm a Valentine baby.
Didn't Elvis Costello sing that?
May well have done, but this is... So Chet Baker died, I think, of drugs overdose when he was 29. There's actually a good film on his life. And, people ask the question, what music moves you, right? And I remember as a 14 or 15-year-old playing that song continuously, lifting up the arm,
I used to do
arm
that.
of my player.
Oh, those were the days, weren't they?
Doing it.
And we can all remember that. Don't pretend you can't.
Hours and hours. The trumpet playing is lyrical, and only, I think, somebody high on drugs could have played the trumpet like it. So Chet Baker and Jerry Mulligan, My Funny Valentine.
Akiko?
I think this is a really sad question because it says, only you can listen to it. And I don't know, that feels really sad to me. So I'm leaning into the sadness and I'm picking a sad favourite song, which is Going to Town by Rufus Wainwright. So,
By who?
Rufus Wainwright.
Oh, I have heard of him, but I don't know the song.
Very sad.
I would pick Paradise by the Dashboard Light by Meatloaf because it's over 9 minutes long.
Excellent.
And I therefore wouldn't get as bored with it as I might some.
You said you had a 15-minute piece of music that you listened to.
Well, I remembered it wasn't 15, it was 9. Or Miss Unites by Cliff Richard. No one can beat that. Thank you to you all for joining us on the panel today. Sir Martin Sorrell, Natalie Bennett, Akiko Hart and Kate Fall. Monday's panel from the Conservative Party conference in Manchester, where we'll be broadcasting live, includes the former Education Secretary Justine Greening and the director of the Onward think tank, Sebastian Payne. But there'll be another one as well. We can only have 3 there because the desk can't take 4. There aren't enough microphones, I think. Anyway, coming up in the next hour on LBC, we're going to return to the first question that we had on Cross Question. The UK's first drug consumption room for illegal drugs has been given the go-ahead in Glasgow. I want to talk about the implications of that. It's the first time that's been officially allowed. I'm sure some years ago we did a phone-in on this where there was going to be plans for one in Brighton, but I don't think it ever happened. Natalie is agreeing with me for one.